As you know, we tried for weeks on end to get Sajid Javid to come on this show, and in the end we backed him into a corner where, in order to get out of doing the Mark Steyn show, he was driven to resign as health secretary and self-detonate his political career. So there's some other bloke in the job now. And yesterday he tweeted as follows, quote, "I've accepted the advice of the JCVI on which vaccines should be offered in the autumn booster program to potentially broaden immunity and relieve pressure on the NHS," unquote. All sounds a bit bloodless and detached, doesn't it? As if he's trying to distance himself. "I've accepted the advice of the Joint Committee on Vaccine and Immunizations. I was only obeying advice." Sorry, pal, doesn't work like that. You're Her Britannic Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. And that means that in the Westminster system, you're responsible, no matter that you're trying very artfully not to nail your own colours to the vaccine mask. Still, it's an interesting shift in tone, at least compared to the good old days of certainty.
You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. Talk about your fake news. Can we get an Ofcom investigation going on that guy? Since saying that, the quadruple vaccinated Joe Biden has had the COVID twice within 3 weeks. Or how about Dr. Sarah Kayat with her claim that you're 100% protected against hospitalization and death? Was there ever any basis for saying what Joe Biden or Dr. Sarah said? I was startled to read this earlier today. What was reported in the mainstream news as being 95% effective against infection was in fact relative risk reduction, not absolute risk reduction, from the double-blind randomized controlled trial that took place during the more lethal circulating post-Wuhan ancestral strain of the virus. That specific New England Journal of Medicine paper, which underpinned the emergency use authorization of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, actually revealed an absolute risk reduction of 0.84%. 0.84%. In other words, for every 119 individuals vaccinated, one person would be protected from being infected, unquote. For every 119 persons vaccinated, one will be protected from infection. That's from an open letter to Joe Biden and Boris Johnson and various parties that also makes the point that your risk of an adverse side effect from the vaccines is greater than your risk of hospitalization from COVID. The author of that open letter, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, joins me now. That's actually quite a staggering number, because if we'd been told that 18 months ago, the whole conversation would have been entirely different.
It's a very good point, Mark. So to talk about what you were mentioning earlier about certainty in medicine, medical evidence, in the history of medical evidence, today's truth may be tomorrow's folly. And medicine, unlike physics or chemistry, is not an exact science, it's an art, and it's based upon information that we're given at a particular time, and it's often the art of probabilities. But to answer your question more specifically, yes, looking back at that original trial that led to the approval of the Pfizer vaccine and many other vaccines, if we talk about the Pfizer vaccine, for example, that trial, it showed this 95% relative risk reduction in infection. Everyone took on board as thinking 95, if 100 people were exposed, 95 would be protected, which is not the case. It was 0.84% from infection, if we trust that data implicitly, which, of course, many people did, even though that data has never been released for independent analysis, which is something we're advocating for. But in addition to that, Mark, that trial didn't show any reduction in death rates from COVID, statistically significant death rates from COVID, or all-cause mortality. So everything we had to go on at the beginning was based upon that figure that was exaggerated in terms of its benefits. I was one of those people that was one of the first to take, I'm double jabbed. I had the vaccine in January 2021 after volunteering in a vaccine center. Even though I was young, I did it because I thought it was going to protect my patients from getting COVID. And, the information has evolved since then considerably. I've spent many months critically analyzing data, speaking to many eminent scientists in Oxford, in Stanford, in Harvard, speaking to Pfizer whistleblowers, and critically looking at that data in its totality. And the situation has very much changed. So now we have, we talked about this was, in reference to the ancestral strain of the virus, which was much more lethal, and it was, certainly, especially for the elderly, it was awful, certainly in 2020, what we experienced then. What's circulating now, Mark, and it's interesting you mentioned Sajid Javid talking about this booster program, is essentially, and this is good news, it's reassuring news, the Omicron strain that is circulating at the moment is no more lethal than the flu. Right. We don't scare people to death around the flu. We shouldn't be scaring people to death around Omicron either.
But one of the things you talk about is the loss of trust. I mean, we have seen that the take-up, for example, of in America, you're supposed to get your 6-month-old boosted, but apparently I think it's only 11% of parents of children, and have taken their kids to get these things. So these vaccines are declining in popularity. Because there's a lack of trust in what the experts say. Now, when you talk about that, that 1 in 19 people will be protected from infection, the people who signed off on these vaccines in the public health bureaucracies of the West, they must have known that, mustn't they?
Mark, I wouldn't say necessarily they did. I mean, I've spoke to very senior doctors, leaders in the last few weeks. I've been giving lectures. I actually gave a lecture only a few weeks ago during the BMA annual conference. And attending that conference were senior doctors, leaders like the chair of the BMA, the president of the BMA, the deputy chair of the BMA. And they were quite shocked with some of the information I was sharing with them. So, for example, one very senior NHS leader was shocked to learn that the regulator that approves these vaccines, the MHRA, receive 86% of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. He didn't believe it, actually, and then the BMJ exposed that only shortly afterwards. And they were also saying to me, it was interesting. I had a conversation with one of these NHS leaders, and he said to me, Aseem, I don't think many people in these roles who are promoting the vaccine are critically appraising the evidence themselves, and they are getting most of their information from the BBC. Now, this is not unusual, because Rochelle Walensky, the former chair of the CDC, actually admitted not so long ago her optimism for the vaccine came from a CNN news report, which Paul Thacker, investigative journalist, basically exposed as being almost an identical. It was essentially the press release of Pfizer that was a CNN news report. So this is quite. So
Pfizer write the press release for the CNN guy. Somebody in the public health bureaucracy of the the most lavishly funded public health bureaucracy, watches the CNN news report and thinks, oh, everything's hunky-dory. But the problem here is that when you say, like, the regulatory body in the United Kingdom, the Medical Health and Regulatory Agency, MHRA, is 86% funded by Big Pharma. Now, 50 years ago, when everybody was worried about lung cancer from smoking, and if you had said, oh yes, we've got our Ministry of Health is 86% funded by Philip Morris and the big tobacco companies, people would have leapt up and said, this is crazy. Why aren't they leaping up now?
I think because they don't know it so much, Mark, and that's important that we have these conversations and we're getting this message out to, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And that's the main reason people aren't aware. So what I say is, to paraphrase Noam Chomsky, the American economist, the doctors and the general population don't know what's happening, and they don't even know that they don't know.
Yes.
So I think people need to understand the structures that are in place that allow what ultimately is misinformation, or certainly misleading information, to disseminate amongst doctors and the population, is rooted in too much unchecked power by entities whose only purpose is to gain profit, not to look after your health. And I'm talking about the pharmaceutical industry here. And they have captured the regulator. And just, Donald Light, sociologist in the BMJ, recently said, people need to understand that the regulators are, as long as they continue to be captured by industry, cannot be trusted, because they are selective, they withhold data, and then this ultimately has a detrimental effect if they are approving drugs without rigorous, independent, critical analysis of what that data tells us, and then how does that data get translated into the conversation between you and I, between the doctor and the patient or the member of the public. So if the doctors are misinformed, the patients then get misled and misinformed.
Well, that's true, but at the same time, we also have a media problem here, because we have things that seem very odd. We have an excess mortality rate right now, have had really all spring and summer, of about 1,000 people a week. Now, dead bodies isn't a sophisticated concept. Everybody can, even the most stupid Fleet Street hack can grasp that there's a lot more dead bodies around than there should be. Why is there a reluctance to actually have an honest look at what's causing that?
It's a great question, Mark. So I think with a lot of these things, certainly it's the excess deaths is probably likely multifactorial. So before, let's say, for example, the vaccines came into the equation in terms of the harms, which you've highlighted very consistently on this program, I would have said, okay, this is probably to a large degree being driven by the end result of lockdowns. You know, we know, as a cardiologist, I know how heart disease develops, how people can develop heart attacks quite quickly, how people can have sudden cardiac death linked to lifestyle factors, including poor diet and stress, right? And we know that people's diets got worse and people are under a lot of stress. But to answer your questions very specifically, in terms of things that aren't being looked at, so for example, could the vaccine be linked to these excess deaths? That's the question. I would say it's willful blindness by many people. And I would say, and this is through my own experience speaking to people, so what does that mean? People turning a blind eye in order to feel safe, to avoid conflict, to reduce anxiety, and to protect prestige. And many people, certainly vaccine injuries are a real thing. There's no doubt about it. The question is, what is the extent of those injuries, and how does that balance against what the benefit of the vaccine is? And we haven't got that answer quite precisely yet, but we're getting there. And what I would say for me as a doctor, what really concerned me, and you mentioned it in the letter we wrote to President Biden and Boris Johnson, and actually published in European Scientist, is very eminent doctors, very eminent scientists, Peter Doshi, Associate Editor of the BMJ, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, in one of their preprint publications, they were able to get access to new data from Pfizer and Moderna original trials on the vaccine. And what they found is shocking. As you said earlier, that in the trial itself, it appeared that one was more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from the vaccine, so disability, life-changing event, hospitalization, than they were to be hospitalized from COVID. And that was during the more lethal strain. Now, if this is true, and there's a good reason to suggest that it is, then it changes everything.
No, it does. And
did Pfizer know this? Did Moderna know this? Because in the history of these sorts of access to raw data occurring from previous drug trials, and as I said, today's truth may be tomorrow's folly, raw data access isn't just about getting data on what happened in the trial with every participant specifically, and was it measured correctly at adverse effects, for example. It also involves getting access to internal emails between executives in those companies. And we need that now because, you know, there is a lack of trust. We've got reduction uptake in boosters. This is not good. It's not good for other public health interventions. And I think the way around this is, let's have an honest conversation with the public first and foremost. We, to some degree, were misled. Things have changed. Okay, we have to change with the evidence. But also, it's imperative now that we get that raw data released, so it's independently analyzed, so people can trust, you know, information that's being given to them when it comes to any kind of health intervention. Because if we don't, this problem is only going to get worse, Mark, I promise you.
No, that's the big takeaway here. As you were saying, you've got more chance of having an adverse side effect from the vaccines than of the vaccine preventing you from hospitalization. And that is
potentially,
why... Potentially, yes. And that is why we need to see everything from Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca. It's interesting, too, just as a quick final thought on that. Normally, after something like the Spanish flu a century ago, your mortality falls because, you know, with the COVID, a guy who might have lived till 2021 or 2022 instead died of the COVID in 2020. So there's normally a sort of correction in reduced mortality after a pandemic. This is weird to have an excess one.
One other thing, Mark, I think is really important to mention, which surprised me, because I was somebody, again, that was on Good Morning Britain to tackle vaccine hesitancy, because a film director, Gurinder Chadha, filmed
I remember that.
You know, she was vaccine hesitant, and I said, because I conflated these vaccines with traditional vaccines, which are one of the safest drugs in the history of medicine, is that I remember I was with my dad, and we got this, I think Public Health England sent out some antibody tests, and we had to fill in a form, and I did the finger prick and antibody. I was like, oh, the vaccine works, and I tweeted it out. And then I recently discovered, and people can look this up, the FDA, since May 2021, on their own website have stated that this is an unreliable surrogate. Antibodies are not reliable in terms of telling you whether you're protected from infection or protection from COVID, especially after COVID-19 vaccinations. That's extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary.
No, you're right. There are many strange questions and strange indicators in this whole thing. Thank you, Doctor. It is always good to talk to you. Yesterday, we